In the Hürtgen Forest, in November of 1944, the deadliest place to be was not in front of a German machine gun. It was lying flat on your back at the bottom of a regulation foxhole, looking up at the trees. The men who dug down and went no further died looking at the sky. The man they called the mole dug down, and then he did something the field manual never told him to do. He went up. He put a roof over his hole. His own sergeant tore the drawing of that roof in half and threw it in the mud, and called him a coward who was afraid of his own front. 11 days later, that same sergeant was pressed against the timber of the mole's dugout, with his eyes shut and one glove over his ear, alive, while the men in the open holes around them came apart in the dark. This is the story of a roof. It is the story of how 3 courses of fir logs and a foot of wet earth, laid at the right angle by a coal miner from eastern Ohio, did what the regulation slip trench could not do in the worst forest on the Western Front. The miner's name I have changed out of respect for a family that is still living. The unit, the forest, the dates, and the engineering are real. You can read the after-action reports yourself. They are thin. They do not say much about the cold, or the smell, or the trees. But they say enough. His real name does not matter here. In this story, he is Tech Sergeant Earl Dabrowski of the 146th Engineer Combat Battalion, attached that month to the 28th Infantry Division. Before the war, he had been a coal miner in Harrison County, Ohio, near a town called Cadiz, and he had spent 14 years 1,000 feet underground, learning the one lesson that the Hürtgen would later make him pay for in full. The lesson was this: the roof is the part that kills you, not the wall.
Not the floor, the roof.
A miner learns to read the rock over his head the way a sailor reads weather, because the rock over his head is the thing that decides whether he walks out at the end of his shift. Earl Dabrowski walked into the Hürtgen Forest already knowing what every infantryman around him was about to learn the hard way, and too late. If you find yourself drawn to the way ordinary men solved impossible problems with their hands, the kind of quiet engineering that never made the history books, consider subscribing. There are more of these accounts than anyone remembers, and most of the men who lived them never told a soul. He came up to the line on the 8th of November. The forest swallowed the road first, and then it swallowed the light. Men who fought in the Hürtgen all said the same thing afterward, in nearly the same words. They said it was dark. Not dark like night. Dark like being indoors. The firs grew so close and so tall that even at noon the floor of the forest sat in a green-brown gloom, and a man could stand 40 feet from another man and not see him. The trees were spruce and fir, planted in rows generations earlier by German foresters who had wanted timber, not a battlefield, and the rows ran straight as graveyard plots in every direction until they blurred. Earl rode the last 2 miles in the back of a deuce-and-a-half that ground forward in low gear, and he smelled the front before he heard it. Wet pine, cordite, and under both, faint and sweetish, the smell that nobody named out loud, the smell of men who had been lying in the open for a week and had not been brought back. The truck stopped where the road stopped, at a clearing that was not a clearing, but a place where the shelling had taken the tops off the trees, and he climbed down into mud that came over his boots and held on like a living thing. The infantry company he was attached to had been in the line 11 days and looked like it had been there 11 years. He had seen tired men before. These were past tired. They moved slowly and they spoke quietly, and their eyes did a thing he recognized from the mines after a roof fall, a kind of flat looking through that meant a man had stopped expecting the next minute to be any better than this one. A lieutenant with a 4-day beard pointed him toward the engineers section and said 2 words, "Dig in," and walked away into the trees. Earl found the section. There were 9 of them left out of a platoon, working a low rise above a firebreak, and they were doing what the manual said to do. They were digging slit trenches and 2-man foxholes, straight down, a flat board or a poncho or nothing at all over the top, the way the army had taught everyone to dig since before the last war. The ground was bad. 6 inches of wet leaf rot, then heavy clay, then in places a band of shale that turned every entrenching tool into a hammer striking a wall. The men cursed it steadily and without heat, the way you curse a thing you have already given up changing. Earl stood at the edge of the rise and did not dig. He looked up. He looked up the way a man looks up in a low mine gallery, reading the trees the way he had read the roof rock for 14 years. And what he saw made the back of his neck go cold. The firs stood 80, 90 feet over the foxholes, dense and unbroken, a solid green ceiling. And he understood, standing there in the gloom with his shovel still on his shoulder, what was going to happen to these men. Not maybe, was going to. The shells, when they came, would not need to land in the holes. They would strike the tops of the trees and burst up there in the crowns, 80 feet over a man's open face. And they would rain steel straight down into holes that had nothing over them but sky. The deeper you dug, the better the target you made of yourself. A foxhole without a roof, under these trees, was a grave with the lid off. A corporal nearby caught him standing and staring, and grinned without any humor in it. "Sky's free, Sarge," he said. "Look all you want." Earl did not answer. He took the shovel off his shoulder, knelt at the edge of the rise, took the stub of pencil and the folded ration card he kept in his breast pocket, and began to draw. He drew a hole, but not a flat-topped hole. He drew it deep and narrow, 2 men with a low timber crib set into the walls, and over the top of it 3 courses of fir logs. The first 2 courses flat, the 3rd course laid across them at an angle, and over all of it a layer of earth a foot deep, tamped down hard. He marked the angle of the 3rd course. He marked it 45 degrees, and beside it, in the small block printing of a man who wrote little and meant all of it, he wrote a single word: up. He was still drawing when the boots stopped beside him, and a shadow fell over the ration card, and a voice he would come to know better than he wanted to said, "What the hell is that supposed to be?" The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Vince Castelli, infantry, 27 years old, out of a coal and steel town himself, though he would never have admitted he and Earl came from the same kind of place. Castelli had been in the line the full 11 days and had brought 2/3 of his squad through it, and that record had made him sure of himself in a way that the forest had not yet broken. He had a clean way of talking and a fast way of moving, and a contempt, deep and genuine, for anything that slowed a man down. He looked at the drawing in Earl's hands the way you look at a child's scribble. "A roof," Earl said. "A roof." Castelli said it back like a foreign word. He looked at the deep, narrow hole, the timber crib, the 3 courses of logs, the foot of earth, the 45 degrees, the 1 block-printed word. "You're going to build a house, while the krauts are 400 yards that way." He crouched down, close, and Earl could smell the cigarettes and the 11 days on him. Let me tell you something, engineer. My men dig a hole and they fight out of it. They don't roof it like they're settling down to raise a family. You put a foot of dirt over a man's head out here, you bury him. You hear me? You bury him alive when the round comes in, and he can't get to his weapon, and he can't get out, and your fancy logs come down on top of him. Earl looked at him for a moment.
Then he looked up.
The way he had been looking up, and he said, quietly, the only argument he ever made out loud that day. "The round's not coming in, Sergeant. It's coming down." Castelli followed his gaze up into the crowns, held it there 1 second, 2, and did not see it, because he had not spent 14 years under a roof of rock learning to be afraid of the thing over his head.
He looked back down,
and his face had gone hard. "It's coming wherever it comes," he said, "and when it does, my men will be up and moving, and yours will be trapped under a foot of mud with a log on his chest." He reached out and took the ration card out of Earl's hand, looked at it one more time, and tore it cleanly in half, and let the 2 pieces fall into the mud between his boots. "The mole," he said, loud enough for the section to hear, and a couple of the men laughed the short, ugly laugh of men who needed something to laugh at. "Look at him, the engineer who's scared of his own front. Dig your grave deep, Mole, put a nice roof on it." He stood, and he walked off down the firebreak into the gloom, and his men followed him, and a few of the engineers were still smiling. Earl knelt in the mud a while longer. Then he bent and picked the 2 halves of the torn card out of the muck, wiped them on his thigh, and fitted them back together in his palm. The pencil line still ran across the tear, the 45 degrees, the one word, up. He looked at the regulation spec the lieutenant had left, the flat-topped, slit trench, 6 inches of overhead at the most, and then he looked back up at the trees that nobody else was looking at. And he understood, in the unconfused way that practical men understand things, that it did not matter in the slightest what Vince Castelli had said, or what the manual said, or what any of them said. He was going to have to build it his own way. He folded the 2 halves of the card together, put them back in his breast pocket, picked up his shovel, and started to dig. Not out, down, and then up. To understand what was bearing down on that low rise above the firebreak, you have to look past the trees, east, toward a village called Schmidt, and a smaller one called Kommerscheid, and a deep wooded gorge called the Kall, with a single bad trail running down through it. The 28th Infantry Division had been ordered to take Schmidt, and beyond Schmidt lay the dams on the Ruhr River, and beyond the dams lay the open ground that the High Command wanted. None of the men digging on the rise knew the name of the dams. Very few of them had heard the word Kall. What they knew was simpler and worse. They knew the line ahead of them was being fed into the trees, a company at a time, and that the companies were not coming back out at the strength they went in. By the 2nd week of November, the attack had already gone wrong in the way these things went wrong, slowly and then all at once. A regiment had pushed into Schmidt and been thrown back out by German armor it had no way to stop, because the tanks that were supposed to support it could not get down the Kall Trail, which had turned to a chute of mud and broken vehicles. Men were holding in Kommerscheid and in the woods around it with what they had, which was rifles and a few guns, and the ground itself. And the ground itself was the only thing on that whole front that a man could improve with his hands. Everything else, the armor, the air, the artillery, belonged that month to the weather and the forest. And the weather and the forest did not belong to the 28th Division. The Germans, for their part, were not the cartoon fanatics of the newsreels. The men opposite were a mixed bag, some of them boys, some of them old, some of them very good and very dangerous indeed. And they had one enormous advantage that had nothing to do with courage. They had been in these woods first. They had ranged every firebreak and every clearing with their artillery and their rocket projectors weeks before the Americans arrived, and they knew, to the meter, where a man would have to stand and where he would have to dig. When a forward observer somewhere in the German line decided the time had come, he did not have to find the range. He already had it. He simply called the woods, and the woods answered, and the shells came in and burst in the crowns, and steel rained down into the open holes. That was the whole grim arithmetic of the Hürtgen, and it ran against the infantry every hour of every day they were in it. Earl Dabrowski did not know the operational picture any better than the corporal beside him, but he did not need to. He had been in enough collapsing rooms underground to recognize a roof about to come down, and the whole forest had that feeling. So he worked. He worked through the 8th and into the 9th, alone at first, digging his hole the way no one else was digging theirs, down and narrow into the bad clay and the shale, and the men of the section watched him with the half-curiosity, half-scorn that men reserve for someone doing visibly more work than the job requires. He was 34 years old, which on that line made him an old man. He had a wife named Helen back in Cadiz, and no children, which was a grief he carried quietly and did not discuss, and a younger brother who had gone down in the same mine that Earl had come out of 2 years before the war, in a roof fall in a gallery that had been left unsupported because the timbering cost money, and the company had decided to save the money. Earl had been 40 feet away when it came down. He had dug for his brother for 9 hours with the rest of the shift, and he had been the one to reach him, and his brother had been dead a long time by then, and that was the thing. More than the army, more than Pearl Harbor, more than anything a recruiter ever said, that had put the iron into Earl Dabrowski on the subject of roofs. He had learned in the worst possible way that the difference between a roof that holds and a roof that does not hold is a few cents worth of timber, and a man who is willing to be called a coward for insisting on it. In his breast pocket, beside the torn ration card, he kept 3 things: a folding boxwood rule, the kind a carpenter or a miner carries, worn smooth and dark with handling, that had been his brother's; a photograph of Helen that had gone soft as cloth from being looked at; and a stub of pencil. That was the whole inventory of the man, and every one of those 3 things would matter before this was over. There was a boy in the section named Tom Ferris. He was 19, a replacement who had come up just 2 days before Earl, from a farm in Indiana, and he had the look that all the new ones had, the look of a young animal that has just understood the trap it is in and cannot yet believe it. He dug his regulation hole where the corporal told him to, flat-topped, open to the sky, and he sat in it, shivering. And at night, Earl could hear him being sick, quietly, trying not to let the others hear. On the evening of the 9th, between the digging and the dark, Earl went and crouched at the edge of the boy's hole and looked down at him. The boy had a letter out. He was reading it by the last of the light, his hands shaking, and he folded it up fast when he saw Earl, embarrassed, the way the young are embarrassed by the things that keep them alive. "From my mother," he said, because he had to say something. "She wants to know, am I eating?" And he laughed, a small, wet sound, and looked at the K-ration tin in the mud beside him, and the laugh went somewhere bad in the middle, and he stopped it. Earl did not say anything about courage. He had no use for that kind of talk, and the boy had no need of it.
What he said was,
"Your hole's wrong." The boy looked up. "Not wrong like you dug it bad, wrong like they taught it wrong." And Earl, crouching in the dark, told the boy the one thing he knew, told it plainly, the way you tell a thing to someone you have decided not to let die if you can help it. He told him about the trees. He told him the shell would not come in the hole. It would come down out of the crowns, and that the only thing that stopped steel falling straight down was something solid over your head, and that the manual was written by men who had never fought under a roof of trees. He told the boy to dig deeper and narrower, so there was less sky over him, and to find logs, and to lay them over the top. "But Sergeant Castelli said," the boy started. "I know what he said," Earl said. "He's not wrong about everything. He's wrong about this." And then, because the boy was 19 and reading a letter from his mother in a hole in the worst forest in Europe, Earl stayed and crouched there in the dark a while, and let the boy talk about Indiana, about a draft horse named Pete, and a sister getting married, and the particular smell of a hayloft in August, until the boy's voice steadied, and the shaking in his hands went down. Then Earl said good night, and went back to his own hole, and did not sleep, because he had decided something, and the deciding of it had taken the sleep out of him. What he had decided was that he was not going to roof one hole. He was going to roof as many as he could before the storm broke, and he was going to start with the boys. The trouble was material. The forest was full of timber, and none of it was the right timber. The standing firs were too big to fell and cut by hand in the time he had, and the deadfalls were soaked through and rotten in the wet. He needed logs of a certain size, 6 to 8 inches, sound, and he needed a great many of them, and the only source of sound cut timber in those woods was the timber the Germans had already cut, and the timber the shelling had already brought down green. So, on the 10th of November, in the grey hour before the light, Earl Dabrowski went out into the firebreak with an axe and a length of rope, and started dragging shattered tree trunks back through the mud toward the rise, one at a time, alone, while the rest of the section was still asleep in their open graves. The corporal woke and watched him do it and shook his head. A man came over from Castelli's squad to see what the noise was and went back laughing. Let them laugh. The cold was coming, real cold, the kind that the men who had been in the line could feel in their teeth a day ahead, the way Earl could feel a roof. And the attack was not finished. Everyone knew Schmidt was not done with them, that they would be ordered forward again, or the Germans would come at them. And when it happened, the trees would fill with steel. He could feel the days running out the way you feel the last of a candle. He had the 10th, maybe the 11th. After that, the arithmetic of the forest would catch up with the section, the way it had caught up with everyone else, and the only question Earl Dabrowski cared about was how many of them would be under a roof when it did. He dragged the logs. He set the first crib into the walls of his own hole, and then he picked up his brother's folding rule, walked the 10 yards to Tom Ferris's open foxhole, knelt down at the lip of it, and began to measure. The first roof he built did not work, and it nearly killed the idea before it had a chance to prove itself. He had laid 3 courses of the dragged-in fir over his own hole, flat, all 3 flat, and tamped a foot of wet clay on top, and he had been pleased with it, and on the night of the 10th, a single stray round came down somewhere off to the left and burst in the trees, and a fragment the size of a thumb came through the top of his roof as though the logs were not there at all, and buried itself in the clay floor between his boots. Earl sat in the dark and looked at the hole the fragment had punched. A clean, round wound straight through a foot of solid timber and earth. And he understood that he had built the thing wrong. Stopping a falling fragment was not about thickness alone. A fragment, coming straight down with all that height behind it, would drive through anything you could pile up by hand if it hit the wood square, along the grain, where the timber wanted to split.
He sat with it the rest of that night.
The way he had sat with bad ground underground, turning it over. And somewhere before the light, it came to him. And it came to him out of the mine. The way everything he knew came to him out of the mine. Underground, you did not stop a fall with one massive beam. You stopped it with layers, with crossed timbering, with a void left deliberately between the rock and the set, so the energy of a slab spent itself moving before it ever reached the props. The trick was not mass. The trick was to make the steel work before it got to the man, to make it pass through one thing and turn and waste itself before it reached the next. So he rebuilt it. 2 courses of logs laid flat and close, as before. Then, instead of piling the earth straight on, he laid the 3rd course across the first 2 at an angle, 45 degrees to the grain of the logs beneath, with a gap of 4 inches deliberately left open between the 2nd course and the 3rd. An air gap.
A void.
And over the angled 3rd course, the foot of tamped earth. He had reasoned it out the way a miner reasons out a set of timber, and the reasoning was this. A fragment coming straight down would strike the angled top course not square, but oblique, along a slope, and an oblique strike does not split timber, it deflects, it skids, it turns the energy sideways. What got through the top course, robbed of its straight line, would cross the 4-inch void as a tumbling thing and strike the flat courses below at 100 wrong angles, and the flat courses, struck wrong, would hold. The angle to deflect, the gap to disorder, the flat mass to stop. 3 jobs, 3 layers, each doing one thing. Up, he had written on the card, and this was what the word meant. He proved it on himself first. He took a German fragment he had dug out of a tree, a heavy, jagged piece, climbed up, and dropped it point down from the height of his own raised arm onto a test section of the new cover he had built off to the side, and it skidded off the angled top course and lay in the mud, and the section underneath was unmarked. It was not science. He had no instruments and no proving ground, and a single dropped fragment proves nothing to a man in a laboratory. But Earl Dabrowski was not a man in a laboratory. He was a miner who had spent 14 years betting his life on the difference between timber that held and timber that did not. And he knew, in his hands and his gut, that the angle and the gap were right. The official histories of that campaign, written long after, put the same principle in colder words. The historian Charles MacDonald, who had commanded a rifle company in those woods himself before he ever wrote a line about them, is among those who described the Hürtgen the way the men who survived it remembered it. The tree burst was the great killer, and overhead cover was the thin difference between a position that could be held and one that could not. That was the lesson of the whole forest, set down by men who had been in it. None of them set it down about Earl. They set it down about all of them. But it was Earl's roof they were describing. By the morning of the 11th, Earl had roofed 3 holes, his own. Tom Ferris's, the boy down on his knees beside him for every log, learning, his hands steadier now, that they had work in them. And a 3rd hole, belonging to a Pennsylvania kid named Lasky, who had watched the boys go up and quietly asked if he could have one too. Ashamed to ask, the way men were ashamed to want to live. 3 holes out of the whole section. And it was while he was setting the angled course on Lasky's hole, in the thin grey light, with the cold so hard now that the mud had stopped being mud and become a kind of stone, that the forest finally decided it had waited long enough. It began as a sound, far off and high, a tearing in the sky like canvas ripping, and every man who had been in the line 11 days knew that sound and was flat before the first round arrived. The shells came down into the crowns of the firs all along the rise, and they burst up there 80 feet over the holes, exactly as Earl had known they would, and the forest filled with steel falling straight down. There was no cover from it on the open ground. A man, flat in a regulation foxhole, was looking up into it. The noise was not like other shell fire. It was overhead and everywhere, a continuous, splintering roar of metal striking wood and wood striking the ground, and both striking men. And through it ran a sound Earl had heard before, in the mine, the sound a thing makes when it comes down on flesh. He was in Lasky's hole when it started, half under the cover he had just built, and he pulled Lasky and Ferris in with him, the 3 of them jammed into a 2-man space under the angled logs, and he held them down with the flat of his arm, and he listened to his roof. He felt the strikes land on it. He felt the angled course take them and throw them, and felt the flat courses below stop what got through. And the 3 of them under it were untouched, were not even scratched, while 10 feet away in the open, the steel was finding the men who had laughed at him. He heard a man screaming who did not stop. He heard a man not screaming who should have been. It went on for what the after-action report, written days later, would call a 40-minute concentration. 2 flat lines of typescript that do not say what 40 minutes is when you are counting it under a roof you built with your own hands, and praying it holds over 2 boys you have decided to keep alive. When it lifted, the rise had been remade. Where the section had dug its regulation holes, there were now craters and splintered stumps, and the wet ruin of men who had had nothing over their heads. Earl came up out of Lasky's hole into a silence that rang, and he counted. The arithmetic was as plain and as terrible as the arithmetic of the forest had ever been. Of the men in open holes on that rise, more than half were dead or torn. Of the 3 men under his 3 roofs, all 3 were alive and unmarked and shaking. 3 roofs, 3 living men. He stood in the smoke with his brother's folding rule in his fist, and he did not feel vindicated. He felt sick, and he felt the cold, and he felt the weight of every hole he had not been given time to build. And it was into that silence that Vince Castelli came walking, up from his squad's position lower on the rise, his face grey, his clean talk gone out of him, looking for the engineer. He had lost men. He stood at the edge of the cratered ground, and he looked at the 3 intact holes with their angled timber roofs standing whole among the ruin. And he looked at Earl, and for a moment, one moment, something passed across his face that was almost the thing Earl had been waiting for. Then it closed. Castelli was a man who had brought 2/3 of his squad through 11 days by being certain, and certainty does not surrender to a single bad morning. "Luck," he said, but his voice was not in it. "You got lucky, Mole. 3 holes." He looked at the dead in the open ground, his dead, and something worked in his jaw. "You can't roof a whole line. You hear me? You build your doll houses for 3 men, and the other 40 die waiting." He turned to go, and then he stopped, and he said the thing that Earl knew was coming, the thing the whole forest had been promising since the 8th. "They're sending us at Schmidt again. Or the Krauts are coming here. Tonight. Tomorrow. And when it's the whole line under it, engineer, your 3 little roofs won't matter a damn." He walked off into the smoke, but this time none of his men laughed, because there were fewer of them to laugh, and the ones that were left had seen the 3 holes, too. That night the forest went quiet, and the quiet was worse than the shelling, because a man could think in it. Earl did not let himself think. He worked. All through the dark of the 11th into the 12th, he dug and roofed by feel, no light allowed, his hands reading the timber the way they had read coal in a black gallery. And by the cold grey of first light, he had got cover over 6 more holes. 9 holes now, out of a section bled down to almost nothing and stiffened overnight by a handful of infantry who had crawled up the rise after the morning's lesson and asked, without quite asking, if the engineer could put a roof over them too. He could not roof them all. He never could. He roofed the ones he could reach with the timber he could drag, and he chose them the way he had chosen the boys, by who was closest and who was youngest and who had the least sky over him, and he did not let himself count the ones he left open, because counting them was a thing that would stop his hands, and his hands could not stop. It came in the last hour before dawn on the 12th, and it came as the worst of them always came, with everything at once. A German push, infantry, and the rocket projectors they called Nebelwerfers, the 6-barreled mortars whose rounds came in with a moaning shriek. The G is called the Screaming Mimi, and the whole weight of it walked up the rise out of the dark. The Nebelwerfer rounds burst in the crowns just like the gun shells, raining down, and under them came the moaning and the small arms fire and the particular held-breath terror of men who could hear an attack coming and could not see it. Earl was in his own hole, the first one he had built, with Ferris jammed in beside him, and Lasky in the next hole over, and the night came apart over their heads. And then, out of the dark and the noise, a man came running. Earl heard him before he saw him, heard the wrong rhythm of a man up and moving in the open under tree-burst, the one thing you must never do. And he came over the lip of a crater at a dead run, making for a regulation hole 20 feet off, the old flat-topped kind, the kind the manual blessed, and a round burst in the crowns above him, and Earl saw him stagger as the steel found him. He went down 10 feet from Earl's roof. And Earl, who had no reason on God's earth to do it, came up out of his own cover into the falling steel, took 2 strides, got a fist in the man's collar, and dragged him backward into the hole on top of himself and Ferris, the 3 of them crushed into a 2-man space, under a foot of earth and 3 courses of fir, while the forest screamed down on the angled logs. It was Castelli. Of course it was Castelli. Earl knew it from the weight of him and the wool of his jacket before he ever saw the face. The staff sergeant who had torn his drawing and named him the Mole, hit in the shoulder and the side, and bleeding into the dirt of the roofed hole he had said would be a grave. He did not say anything. He could not. He lay pressed against the timber wall with his eyes shut and one gloved hand clamped over his ear, the way a man does when the only thing left to do is wait and not hear. And over the 3 of them, the steel came down and struck the angled course and skidded and crossed the gap and died in the flat logs below. And the roof held. It held through the Nebelwerfer concentration, and it held through the small arms storm, and it held until the German push broke against the line and pulled back into the trees it had come from, and the light came up, grey and filthy through the smoke, and the three men under the roof were alive. Two whole, one bleeding but alive. Alive under a foot of earth that the man who was bleeding had said would bury them. When it was full light, Earl came up and went down the rise, counting again, the only arithmetic that ever mattered to him. The open holes had been hit hard a second time. He found men he had talked to the day before who were not there anymore, in any way that counted. But under the 9 roofs, the 9, he found 9 living men,